Okay, hello. Now we're going to talk about respiration. So this is Dr. David Green, Human Physiology, and these are the short but to the point video lectures on what you need to know about any particular organ system that we've been covering. So as I said, this week we're going to look at respiration. I want to look at it in five stages. So on the board here I've got basic anatomy of the respiratory system and the point of breathing. I mean, it's really important that in the respiratory system we actually understand why all of this is being done. What is the end purpose? After that, in the next lecture, we're going to look at mechanical ventilation of the lungs, how they're actually made to breathe. Then we're going to look at how that's controlled in a kind of two-step process. And then to finish off, we're going to look at how oxygen is transported from the lungs and then released at the cells. And then we're going to finish off with looking at how the carbon dioxide is picked up from the cells as a byproduct and then taken back to the lungs and released back into the atmosphere. And that brings into it acid-base balance, which I'll talk about as well, because acid-base balance will again be looked at when we look at the urinary system and how the kidneys operate, because they're the last of the three ways in which we monitor and ameliorate the buildup of carbon dioxide. But in this section, I actually want to look at what acid-base balance is and talk a little bit more about why it's important and how it's basically managed in the body and what can happen when it goes wrong. Alright, so I just dropped a pen, so I'll go get that. Okay, back. So, in this one, we're going to look at basic anatomy of the lungs. Now, I'm not going to stand here and take a lot of time drawing it all out because this is physiology and we've covered this in anatomy. So, however you do your course, whether it's human anatomy and human physiology separated or whether it's A&P1, A&P2, we do the anatomy first, but let's recap on what that is. In the respiratory system, starting at the face, this is supposed to be a nose and a mouth and a chin. Pathologies, the dogs have just decided that something has arrived at the house that shouldn't have done, so they're barking, so I apologise if you're hearing that over the microphone. So we've got the mouth and the nose here. I've only really joined this part because I want to draw the attention really to the fact that air comes in via the nose. We breathe in through our nose if we can. The reason for this is that the nose and the cavity sitting behind the nose is designed to both warm the air, so it's the same as it is in our lungs, and also add moisture to the air, and that occurs all the way down through the respiratory system. So by the time the air that we've breathed in arrives at the alveoli, ready to be, oxygen to leave and carbon dioxide to come into the lungs, it's warm and it's wet. So the nose is capable of doing that, the mouth is not. Of course, when we're breathing hard, we become mouth breathers, and that's a less efficient way of warming the air, but it gets more in at one given breath. So the air comes down, let's just mark that through. So the air enters through our nose, it hits the turbinates, gets circulated, warmed up, a little moisture comes down the nasopharynx. I'm just going to put an MP there for that, or NPH. Nasopharynx, then goes past the oropharynx and finally hits the laryngopharynx, so the whole of the pharynx. The pharynx here is important because it's soft tissue. After the hard palate, the roof of the mouth, it becomes soft palate, and this is all soft tissue. There's no cartilage holding this open, but there are muscles and things in there, and there is also the ability for swelling in that tissue. And this is the reason why I'm pointing it out just now, is that once we get into the trachea is a tube which is held open by C-shaped cartilage. So these C-shaped cartilages make sure that the trachea remains an open tube, even when there's nothing in it, if you like. So from the trachea all the way down through the primary bronchi through all the branching to the small bronchioles, right all the way through to the terminal bronchioles, and then the respiratory bronchioles. Once we hit that point, we have smooth muscle. But up until that point and above the trachea, from that point through to the start of the trachea, this is all cartilage holding the tubes open, so this is an open system. The vulnerable parts are this bit here, the terminal and respiratory bronchioles, which is part of the respiratory zone, which is essentially really the respiratory bronchioles plus alveoli. And in the conducting zone, all open, but then this part of the conducting zone here, the pharynx, which is the back of the throat, is also not held open with cartilage, and that makes it vulnerable to swelling, and that is when we talked about in the immune system, anaphylaxis, the closing of the throat, swelling in the back of the tongue, or the tongue itself, and swelling in the throat becomes very dangerous because that part of our respiratory system is soft, there's no hardness to keep it open, the tube open, and therefore it becomes vulnerable to closing. Also, right at the ends, when we get to the alveoli and the respiratory zone here, we have no cartilage again, it's smooth muscle, so it can be opened and closed. And this is what asthma sufferers experience, because it's this end, the respiratory zone of the respiratory system, where they have bronchial constriction. The smooth muscle contracts and makes the tubes narrower, so in their out breath, so they go hee, hee, and that wheeze is normally heard on the expiration when you're listening with a stethoscope, and that is the air squeezing through from the alveoli and the respiratory bronchioles back through the conducting zone, or into the conducting zone, because of the smooth muscle constriction right at the very ends of the bronchial tree. The rest of it's all kept open. It can be narrowed by mucus and blockage and things like pneumonia and stuff like that, but unfortunately in these 5 talks I don't really have a lot of time to go into disease, which is very interesting, and also the end point of, for many people, is why studying this in the first place. So that's more pathophysiology, and we'll leave it for that. Alright, so we've got our basic anatomy. We've got our nose, nasal cavity, nasal, oral, laryngopharynx, into the trachea, into the primary bronchi, 22 orders of branching. The bronchi become smaller and known as bronchioles, and they arrive at the respiratory zone, respiratory bronchioles to alveoli, alveoli where the gas exchange occurs with the blood capillaries feeding the lungs. And so I've just represented that as a blue line coming up as deoxygenated blood going across the lungs. The purple is where the gas exchange is taking place, and then coming away from the lungs as oxygenated blood. Now I'm going to put a few numbers up here right now, and we're going to look at this when we actually look at transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide. But in deoxygenated blood, the partial pressures of oxygen is 40 millimeters of mercury. Well, let me draw that. Millimeters mercury. And in carbon dioxide is 46 millimeters of mercury in the deoxygenated side. Once it goes through the lungs, the oxygen increases. So now we have the oxygen coming away at 100 millimeters of mercury pressure, partial pressure, and the CO2 has gone from 46 down to 40 millimeters of mercury. So these two numbers change, and the oxygen side changed dramatically from 40 up to 100, and carbon dioxide 46 down to 40, but it's taking off just enough to keep the blood pH as it should be, between 7.35 and 7.45. So this is the blood feeding that system. So what's the point of our breathing? Well, we're getting oxygen into the blood. We're taking carbon dioxide out of the blood. Right, that's great. So why do we need oxygen? have a think about that. Why do we breathe oxygen? I mean, we can talk about it from an evolutionary point of view, because when oxygen appeared on the planet, it was a huge toxin. It was destroying everything, and then new chemical pathways became, were forced into existence to try and deal with this oxygen. But for our purpose as human physiologists, we want to know what this oxygen's all for. Why are we going to all of this trouble having an entire organ system dedicated to taking this oxygen up? And the reason is, at the cellular level, we've drawn a cell here, we've got our nuclei in our cell, we've other organelles, but we've also got mitochondria. Now, we came across these at the start of the course, and we should be aware of them now. Mitochondria, it's often referred to as the powerhouses of cells. And they're called the powerhouses of cells because they create the energy. They're the generators of energy in the cell. Now, if we take one of these mitochondria, blow it up, and remind ourselves of cellular respiration, and notice that when we're talking about cellular respiration, there's that word again, respiration. So we've got respiration covering gases coming in and out of the respiratory system, moving in and out of the blood, and arriving at the cells and entering the mitochondria. So it's all part of the respiratory process. So what's important? Well, here's our mitochondria. Now, I'm not going back through week 3's work. You can do that in your own time if you're rusty on it. But you should be able to remember that glucose, C6H12O6, and I'm going to put a thing here, via glycolysis in cytoplasm. So this goes through glycolysis and gets broken down. If it's oxygen present, it's going to get broken down to acetyl coenzyme A, which is a 2-carbon molecule that enters the mitochondrion from breakdown of this glucose that we've taken in, and that goes through the Krebs cycle, and in the Krebs cycle it loads hydrogens off these molecules. Hydrogens get loaded onto NAD and FAD, and they are carried off onto the side of the inner wall of the mitochondria to go through the electron transport chain, and this is why we have oxygen. Oxygen is there at the end of the transport chain, pulling the hydrogen electron down its energy levels. So when the hydrogen arrives at the start here, remember all hydrogen is, when we talk about the hydrogen atom, it is one proton surrounded by one electron. So when you release a hydrogen here, it's not too difficult to take the electron away. The proton is a positive, so we write that as H+, and we've got the electron, which is a negative. So when the hydrogens arrive here, the electrons are dancing from high to lower to lower to lower energy levels, being drawn by the power of the oxygen. The protons, through to this energy being produced by the electron jumping from one to other, are pushed into the inner membrane space. And so you build up a big concentration of hydrogen here, hydrogen ions, and then you bring them back, let them flow back into the stroma of the mitochondria, and that gives the energy and an enzyme, ATP synthase, to, I'll write that there, ATP synthase, which creates ATP from joining PI and ADP together. Now that is the whole point of why we breathe, to create ATP in the mitochondria of our cells, which will drive all of the reactions in our cells that require an energy input. Without that ATP, we cannot live. Without oxygen to give us a large amounts of ATP from single molecules of glucose, we similarly will not survive very long. So our respiratory system is all based around the capturing of oxygen and the delivering of that oxygen to the cells, indeed to the mitochondria, for energy production. But there is one other aspect to that story that cannot be ignored clinically. Because of all of this, and the carbon dioxide and oxygen going into the mitochondria, the energy coming out, which is great. We have some water as a byproduct. Okay, water's good, we're 67% water, that's not an issue. But we produce this too, this thing here, CO2, carbon dioxide. Now of course, that's why when our blood is coming back to our lungs, it's higher in carbon dioxide than when it goes through the lungs and the carbon dioxide's peeled off and given away in our breath, because it's a byproduct of our energy production. Why do we need to get rid of it? Couldn't we use it for something else? Well, not really, is the answer to that. And I'm going to put up an equation now, which we're going to live with in this particular organ system, and particularly when we look at urinary again. It's a very important equation because it tells us a lot of information about what's going on at the cellular level and why we need to keep our blood, etc., in very tight control for acidity levels. And when it goes off, well, clinically that's when we're really quite ill. So what is it? Let's do it in a colour that we can see quite clearly from everything else. Let's do it in blue. So, right, I'm going to start with that and explain it. First of all, I'm going to try and take this stuff off. Give me a bit more room to work with. Okay. So let's remind ourselves. Carbon dioxide is a byproduct from cell respiration. Now it's produced from the Krebs cycle in particular. So, or equals energy production. So the more energy we produce, the more carbon dioxide as a byproduct we're going to also produce. Now, why is this important? Well, water can be in the cell, or it could be in the blood. Remember, we've got our ICF and ECF, which is just our fluid volumes. So inner cellular volume, intracellular fluids, extracellular fluids. So water everywhere. So when carbon dioxide and water are put together, they produce this thing here, and this thing here is called carbonic acid. I'm going to do this again. Carbonic acid. Acid, remember from your chemistry? Hydrogen ions. Also remember that the blood pH is 7.35 to 7.45 in pH. So very tightly controlled. Every time we're producing energy, we're producing something which creates an acid, which in the cell will start creating the cell to become more acid, and so the cell kicks it out into the blood, and so the blood starts becoming more acid. If you didn't remove it from the blood, we'd basically drop below 7.35 relatively quickly and head toward, say, 7, which is actually neutral, but we'd be very ill if our blood pH was 7. So, why is this acid a problem? Well, because once it's formed, it dissociates into the hydrogen ion, which creates the acid problem, but it also gives us this, which is bicarbonate, HCO3 minus. And we'll see the importance of this when we start looking at transport of carbon dioxide in the lungs. But I wanted to get it up there to start with so we have some idea what we're talking about when we get there. But this equation here, CO2 plus water, goes to carbonic acid, H2CO3, dissociates to hydrogen ions, and bicarbonate is very, very important in terms of acid-base balance. This is what derives, basically drives acid-base balance, and the reason why we have to have mechanisms to maintain the balance. So this can go left to right, but it can also go right to left, because that's why the arrows are pointing in both directions. This can be performed back into carbonic acid and back into CO2 and water where the conditions are correct. Alright, so that is what I wanted to say in the introduction. We've covered the basis of the anatomy of the respiratory system itself, and we have also looked at the point of the respiratory system, or respiration, which is to use oxygen to produce ATP, and also a means by which to remove carbon dioxide, which is a byproduct from that process, which left in the body would turn the body into an acid environment. So those are the points I want you to take away from the first one, and when we come back we'll look at the mechanical processes which control ventilation, or air movement in and out of the lungs. So thank you for listening.